Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this video lecture is going to cover reflexes for my class as well as Dr. Camp's anatomy and physiology. So let's start with a quick introduction. So conditions inside or outside the body can change rather quickly and unexpectedly. And so reflexes offer a response to these quick changes. So reflexes are often rapid and automatic responses to specific stimuli. They preserve homeostasis by making quick adjustments, basically, in the function of organs or organ systems. The responses show very little variability, so each time a reflex is activated, it's usually going to produce the same motor response. A reflex usually removes or opposes the original action. Therefore, it's an example of negative feedback. Now, the route that's followed by the nerve impulse involved in these reflexes is called a reflex arc. So like I mentioned, a reflex is an involuntary, stereotypical response of a muscle group or an organ from the stimulation of a receptor. So the reflexes are going to be executed by activation of a certain number of neurons that are going to be connected. And the last neuron is going to innervate whatever that effector tissue is or effector organ is. Usually that's going to be a muscle. So let's go through this pathway real quick. So the reflex arc has 5 components. There's somatic receptors. These receptors are there to pick up or detect the stimulus, and that's going to activate the reflex arc. And then an afferent nerve is going to carry that sensory signal to the central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord. And then one or more interneurons are going to connect the sensory signal to the motor output. Now, sometimes an interneuron may not be involved at all, and we will get to that later. After the interneuron is activated, it's going to transduce the signal to an efferent neuron, and it will carry the motor command. It's going to be a motor neuron, and it's going to carry the motor command from the central nervous system to the effector organ, and the effector organ is then going to respond to the stimulus. So let's go through these steps again, and let's do that while we're looking at an image. So here we are with a chunk of skin, and you can see these little lightning bolts. That's going to indicate there's a painful sensation. So in this case, we have the arrival of a stimulus and activation of a receptor. So that's going to be the skin being pierced by a nail, and this is going to cause a change or a detection by receptors in the skin. And those receptors, typically pain receptors, are sensitive to physical or chemical changes. And that is going to activate the sensory neuron. The result of this activation of the sensory neuron is that a nerve signal is going to travel down the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. So once it gets to the spinal cord, it's going to be processed in the integration center by the interneuron. So there's an interneuron there. And then that interneuron is going to transduce the signal to the efferent nerve or the motor neuron. That's going to be transduced, or that's going to be propagated along the motor neuron. Ultimately, what's going to happen is it's going to affect a response. In this case, it's going to cause contraction of the muscle, which will cause the forearm to move up and away from the painful stimuli, hopefully without the nail still attached. But I guess that depends on how hard you hit it in the first place. So we have our stimulus, the pain, the nail piercing the skin, the nerve signal traveling down the afferent or sensory neuron. It's going to arrive in the spinal cord. There's an interneuron that is going to connect, in this case, the afferent and efferent neuron, the sensory and motor neuron. then there's going to be a signal that leaves the spinal cord through the motor neuron, and that's ultimately going to send chemical messages to that muscle and cause it to contract in this example. All right, so let's take a look at some different types of classifications of reflexes. So there's several different methods for classifying them. They can be classified on the basis of their development, the nature of the resulting motor response, so how the reflex responds, the complexity of the circuitry involved, as well as the site of information processing. So for development, we're looking at either innate or acquired reflexes. Reflexes that are innate are those that you're born with. Innate reflexes result from connections that form between neurons during development. And they're going to typically appear in a very predictable sequence, with the simplest ones occurring first, like withdrawal from pain, and then you may have chewing or sucking or tracking objects with the eyes. Acquired reflexes are more complex and they're learned. For example, an experienced driver would step on the brake when you see brake lights ahead. These motor responses are rapid and automatic, but they're learned rather than pre-established. In addition, repetition will enhance acquired reflexes. The response is another way to classify, so you can have somatic or visceral. A somatic response or a somatic reflex provides a mechanism for involuntary control of the muscular system, and there's a lot of different types. For example, superficial reflexes are triggered by stimuli at the skin or the mucous membranes. A really familiar example of this would be the knee jerk or patellar reflex that you have tested when you go to for a physical exam. Somatic reflexes are different. They are vital primarily because they are immediate. So making decisions and coordinating voluntary responses take time, but in an emergency you don't necessarily have that time. So if you slip while walking down a flight of stairs or accidentally press your hand against a knife or something hot, any delay in your response is going to increase the likelihood of severe injury. Therefore, somatic response or somatic reflexes are going to provide a rapid response that can be modified later if necessary by your voluntary system. Now, visceral reflexes, they are autonomic and they often control the activities of other systems like your cardiac muscles or your glands. Now, reflexes can also be defined as either monosynaptic or polysynaptic, and that's depending on how many neurons the circuit involves. So a monosynaptic reflex is going to involve the simplest reflex arc. In this case, the reflex involves a sensory neuron, and it's going to directly interact with a motor neuron. So a sensory neuron is going to bring information, directly interact with that motor neuron. There's no interneuron here. But this is not necessarily the typical case. Most reflexes are more complicated and have at least one interneuron between the sensory and motor neuron, and these are going to be those polysynaptic reflexes. Polysynaptic reflexes are going to have a longer delay between stimulus and response. And they'll have a delay that's proportional to the number of synapses involved. So the more neurons you get involved, the longer it's going to take. The final classification is the processing site. So if they're processed in the spinal cord, it's a spinal reflex, and that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation. If they're processed in the brain, then it's a cranial reflex. Now, so let's start out with monosynaptic reflexes. Like I said, this is a very simple reflex. A monosynaptic reflex, there's little delay in the sensory input and the resulting motor output. And these reflexes control some of the most rapid and best known reflexes. One of those here is the stretch reflex, which automatically regulates skeletal muscle length. So this is the one I mentioned before, the knee jerk or the patellar reflex. So in this case, the stimulus is an increase in muscle length caused by the reflex hammer, which is shown here. Now, this stretch on the muscle is detected by a sensory region in the muscle itself. And in this image that just came up, that's that kind of white area in the muscle. Ultimately, this stretch detection activates the sensory neuron, and that synapses directly with the motor neuron in the spinal cord. And then this triggers an immediate motor response. In this case, it's contraction of the stretched muscle to counteract that stimulus. The entire reflex is completed within 20 to 40 milliseconds. Because there's very little, there's only 2 neurons involved, and it's also propagated along those myelinated fibers. And remember, we've discussed that myelination increases the speed of the nerve impulse. So let's talk about polysynaptic reflexes next. A polysynaptic reflex can produce a far more complicated response than a monosynaptic reflex. Polysynaptic reflexes range in complexity from a simple tendon reflex to really complicated reflexes associated with standing and walking and running. But they all share some very similar characteristics. So one, they involve pools of interneurons. So processing occurs before the motor neuron is activated. In this case, the result may be excitation or inhibition. So for example, the interneuron may excite a motor neuron and cause contraction of a muscle, or the interneuron may inhibit a motor neuron and have no contraction or relaxing. They involve more than one spinal segment. And what I mean by this is the interneurons that are interacted with can extend across the spinal segments and even may activate muscle groups in many parts of the body. They also involve reciprocal inhibition. What do I mean by that? It means you coordinate muscle contractions and reduce resistance to movement. So that means you're going to coordinate your muscle movements better. Okay, so if one muscle needs to contract, then obviously the antagonist to that needs to relax. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to coordinate those muscle movements. So now I'd like to go through a couple examples of polysynaptic reflexes. The first example here is a withdrawal reflex. So withdrawal reflexes move the affected part of the body away from a stimulus, basically exactly the way it sounds. So painful stimuli will usually trigger the strongest type of withdrawal, but you can also get this reflex from touch receptors or from pressure receptors as well. So in this case, we're looking at grabbing a hot pan on the stove. So when the pain receptors in the hand here are stimulated, this activates the sensory neuron. So we have a signal traveling to the spinal cord, and that's going to interact with or activate multiple interneurons. Recall that a nerve contains many neurons, so there's the ability of those different neurons in that nerve to interact with different interneurons. Okay, so an inhibitory interneuron, like this one, it's going to release inhibitory neurotransmitters. And what that's going to happen is, what that's going to cause is a signal will move down the motor neuron, and that will result in relaxing, in this case, of the triceps. Now, a stimulatory interneuron is going to stimulate, it's going to release stimulatory neurotransmitters, and that's going to cause a nerve signal that ultimately will cause the bicep to contract. Remember, one muscle needs to relax, one muscle needs to contract if that forearm is going to move at all. Okay, so the end result ultimately is the withdrawal, and that's going to take that hand away from the hot pan. Now, whenever you have this withdrawal reflex, it's always going to be the same, but I do want to mention that the strength of that response is going to depend on the intensity and the location of the stimulus. All right, now let's look at a more complicated example. Here we're looking at a polysynaptic reflex where we go across the spinal cord. So this one's called a crossed extensor reflex. So in the previous reflex example, the sensory stimulus and the motor response occurred on the same side of the body. In this case, the crossed extensor reflex is going to involve contralateral reflex arc. Contra means opposite, so we're going to have a reflex arc that goes onto the opposite side of the body. And so this is because the motor response is going to occur on the opposite side of the stimulus. Okay, we're also going to have a motor response occurring on the same side of the stimulus as well. So here we have first a painful stimulus occurs. In this case, this person has not worn shoes and they've stomped on a rock and it's caused pain in their foot. Okay, and of course this is going to result in a sensory neuron sending signals to interneurons. Again, that neuron contains many nerves, so the nerves can interact with different interneurons. And then the interneurons are going to stimulate and inhibit different motor neurons that's ultimately going to result in withdrawal of the limb. So here we have an interneuron is going to send out both stimulatory and inhibitory. It's not showing both in this case. Stimulatory and inhibitory responses to the muscle, because we need one muscle to contract and one muscle to relax. Ultimately, that foot is going to lift up. Now, if the reflex just involved this, we would probably fall down, because if you're just quickly going to lift up your leg without using any other muscles, it's going to throw you off balance. You're going to fall down, maybe land on the rock. So we need to have a simultaneous response that gets muscles in the other leg involved. Okay, so in this case, we're going to have an interneuron that is going to cross to the other side. So that interneuron here is going to cross to the other side, and it is going to stimulate a motor neuron that's ultimately going to cause the extensor muscles on the other side of the body to contract. And what that's going to do is help balance and support the body weight. So we've had a response, a withdrawal response, just like the previous one. And we've also had this crossed extensor reflex where we've had the muscles in the other leg contract and provide balance and support. And I'll leave you with this final slide here listing the several different reflexes. This slide specifically is going through those that are clinically important. I suggest that you look through this table in the book as well. And that's it for this presentation. Thank you.